Hey everyone, Tactics here with my full Protection Warrior guide for Dragonflight's first season. I'll be covering all the things that you need to know if you want to play Prout Warrior, including talent builds and variations for both Raid and Mythic Plus, what your best stats, consumables, and enchants are, what your rotation should look like, and much, much more. Just a reminder before getting into it, if you enjoy all the content I create, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It's free for you to do, and it really does help me out, and I appreciate all of the support you guys have given me. With all that said, let's dive into the guide itself, and we'll start off by talking about some of the changes these specs saw moving from Shadowlands into Dragonflight. Maybe one of the biggest winners out of all of the 6 tank specs going into the new expansion, Prout Warriors gained, or maybe better wording would be regained, some very powerful synergies that were either taken away or made too difficult to obtain in Shadowlands, like the combo of Thunderlord and Booming Voice. Along with these older synergies, they also gained some new toys with abilities like Spell Block, Battle Scarred Veteran, and even their 2-piece from Shadowlands in Violent Outburst, all available as options. It's pretty well known at this point that in the past, early in expansions, Prout Warriors have tended to struggle with 3 major things. 1. Rage generation, 2. Shield block uptime, and 3. Magic and bleed damage. Going into Dragonflight, all 3 of these common issues have actually been addressed in their talent trees. For Rage Generation, a big thing has been the addition of bleeds like Thunderous Roar and Rend, alongside of course Deep Wounds, and they now all have the ability to generate rage from their ticks through Blood Surge. On top of this, while Rend has a rage cost, it spreads itself for free from Thunderclaps with the Blood and Thunder talent, so it's essentially just free Rage Generation. When that's added to Violent Outburst proc Shield Slams, you actually feel a bit flooded with a Rage and AoE scenarios, and you have a nice drip in lower target ones. When it comes to Shield Block uptime, the Reprisal Legendary has been kind of revamped into a 45-second cooldown in Shield Charge if you invest another point into it, and along with the ability to grab both Heavy Repercussions and Enduring Defenses alongside it, maintaining Shield Block isn't really a problem, allowing you to get pretty close to 100% uptime on the ability already just in the first patch of the expansion. Finally, having access to 10% passive leech in their talent tree, alongside things such as previously mentioned Spell Block, as well as the combo of Brutal Vitality along with their new 4-piece, addresses their known weaknesses to both magic and bleed damage, and essentially kind of erases this weakness entirely. So I guess what I'm trying to say is Prout Warrior is in a fantastic spot going into 10.0. They feel great to play, they'll be familiar to you if you played the spec back in BFA, and they have some new twists and tools that address literally every single one of their previous weaknesses, leaving them as probably the most durable tank in the game at the moment, while also being able to blast out solid burst damage, especially if you're able to take advantage of the reintroduced stance dancing. Now that we've talked about some of the changes, let's go into their talent builds. I'll go over one for Raid and Mythic Plus separately here, and then talk about some potential variations you can make for each of them. Those will be linked down in the description as well if you want to import them for yourself. Starting off though, let's talk Mythic Plus, where you'll likely be playing something like this. Taking a look at the warrior class tree first, you have a few openings here, namely Bounding Stride if you want more mobility, Berserker Rage for a fear and in-cap immunity, Inspiring Presence if you need a bigger rally for a certain boss or trash bowl, and even Titanic Throw to make grouping up several packs a bit easier. In terms of what you'd have to give up, Pain and Gain Trickle Healing is likely one of the first things you'd get rid of. This is for the most part just kind of pad healing on the meter, especially for a spec like Prout who has a lot of absorbs, as well as Leech and Impending Victory to provide some actual self-healing. You could also drop Sidearm, which is a very slight DPS loss, but not the end of the world to lose. Finally, if a dungeon is particularly lacking in AoE stops, or your group just has a ton of them in their composition, you could also drop Intimidating Shout. If we move to the spec tree here, there's a lot of AoE damage decisions being made here thanks to how durable warriors are, but if you want to lean more into a defensive side, you're able to. Spell Block is an option on the right side choice node. I've defaulted to Tough as Nails for additional damage, but if there's ever a dungeon where you need Spell Block, feel free to swap that out. Their new pseudo cheat death in Battle Scarred Veteran is also available still. I'd recommend only taking this in harder forms of content. Similarly, you can pick up Impenetrable Wall for additional Shield Slam, Rage, and Shield Wall CDR, but even in mid-level keys, you really won't need to use Shield Wall on cooldown, so the value of this talent does go down in those situations, so mostly for harder content. For some additional utility, Disrupting Shout is available. Reminder though, this is an interrupt, not a silence, so the mobs have to be somewhat synced up in their casts in order to get value out of this. Looking at what you have to potentially give up to gain any of these things, there's Show of Force, which is just pure AoE damage. There's Punish, which adds both single target damage and durability, but also maybe worth dropping as well. And there's also Enduring Alacrity in the bottom of the tree that just gives you some passive stamina armor, and haste that you'd have to lose out on if you want that pseudo cheat death. Then we have the raid build, where this is likely going to be your standard setup, and you have a few different variations depending on the boss fight and your individual needs. If we look at the general tree, currently we've passed on utility like Intervene and Stormbolt, but if those are ever needed, they can be grabbed, as can something like Seismic Reverberation on fights where you consistently have 3 or more targets. In order to make room for those talents, things like Pain and Gain, Honed Reflexes, Sidearm, and Inspiring Presence could all be dropped depending on the fight. For the spec tree, we've opted out of talents that get more value from AoE, such as Blood Surge Rage Regeneration, Thunderlord Demo Shout CDR, and Show of Force, and instead we've replaced them with things better in lower target count scenarios like Instigate, Impenetrable Wall, and Sudden Death. In the capstone tree, I've also grabbed the Battering Ram, which gives shield charge some extra crit, but more importantly, causes it to give you a 20-second, 20% attack speed increase, which has a ton of synergy with the Warrior kit, thanks to things like War Machine and Devastator. One of your other options here is to move away from a heavy repercussion build if you don't need that extended shield lock uptime, which lets you pick up a ton of haste from Into the Fray, assuming you can stay near 5 targets. To make up for this large loss in shield block uptime though, you may need to drop Tough as Nails or Spell Block and instead grab Bolster just to help you fill in any potential gaps. Then let's talk a bit about the new tier set coming in the first raid, Vault of the Incarnates, which is centered around your Revenge usage. The 2-piece causes Revenge to grant you Vanguard's Determination, which increases your damage done and decreases damage taken by 4% for 5 seconds, so just a little boost here for pressing Revenge consistently. The 4-piece adds on to this bonus, causing you to gain Ignore Pain equal to 5% of the damage you deal while Vanguard's Determination is active. The second bonus is the reason why you saw Brutal Vitality as a lock-in talent for the first tier. Brutal Vitality on its own kind of requires you to actively put up Ignore Pains for it to get value, but now with the tier bonus, you'll automatically be applying Ignore Pains just by existing, assuming you press Revenge sometimes, and that triggers the Brutal Vitality talent as well, so the tier kind of lets you get way more value out of this talent than you would otherwise. Overall, I do think this is one of the stronger tank tier bonuses in my opinion. Really helps to contribute to the insane durability Prout Warriors have in Season 1, particularly against magics and bleed damage. From there, we can talk a little bit about Prout Warriors Rotation, which doesn't have too much of a variation between AoE and single target. I'm going to take into account here some of the longer cooldown abilities, but basically your standard rotation is going to look something like using Avatar on cooldown whenever it's up, sending that with Ravager and Thunderous Roar as well, which will line up in Mythic Plus. They'll both be 1.5 CDs. In Raids, one's going to be a minute, one's going to be 1.5 minutes, so it might desync a little bit there. Then you've got Demo Shout as well for that damage amp from Booming Voice if you don't need it for defense, followed by Shield Slam on CD, Thunderclap on CD, and then your Rage dumps in Execute if it's single target and in Execute range, or Revenge if it's in AoE or not in Execute range. The biggest thing here is trying to never cap on Rage, as using that Rage feeds into self-healing from Indomitable, as well as Avatar and Shield Wall CDR from Anger Management, so it's both a DPS and durability increase to keep churning out spenders. More on that coming in the defensive playstyle section. Though, when it comes to cooldown usage, you want to ensure both Ravager and Thunderous Roar are cast inside those avatar windows, as this is where the biggest amount of Prout Warriors burst damage comes from, so making sure you have that 20% damage boost is very important. Ideally, you'd also like to use Demo Shout immediately after using these cooldowns as well, since again, it also has that 20% damage boost when you have that Booming Voice talent. On top of this, if you're really trying to min-max your damage, this is also the highest value time to stance swap into Battle Stance to get the most out of your burst damage. Always be careful when doing this though, as you'll be losing that 20% passive DR, so it can be very dangerous if you're actively tanking, especially if you're actively tanking at a high difficulty content. So depending on what you're doing, this may or may not be something you want to try. The only adjustment here that I would make in a multi-target scenario would be Thunderclap usage, which overtakes Shield Slam in priority, specifically during Avatar when you have that Unstoppable Force buff. Otherwise, even in AoE, stick to Shield Slamming for priority damage and extra rage generation, then Thunderclapping afterwards. When it comes to Violent Outburst usage, it's pretty simple here again. You want to try and use this as much as possible on Shield Slam, even in AoE, because it just gives you so much more rage. If you're looking at maximum damage and don't care much about rage, once you start getting over 5 targets, that's when the Empowered Thunderclap starts outperforming the Empowered Shield Slam. But again, the Shield Slam just gives so much more rage, so that's why I would recommend prioritizing using that with your Violent Outburst procs. Note that Rend isn't on this list, again because it gets automatically applied and is sustained just by using Thunderclap thanks to that Blood and Thunder talent. On top of this, best served cold procs don't really increase the priority of using revenge, it just takes away that rage cost, so just whenever you have a spare GCD and this proc is up, feel free to use them. Similarly, in a raid, when you're running sudden death, just use those free execute procs whenever you have an available GCD. Now let's talk a little bit about defense, in particular, what you need to focus on to stay alive, and the tools at your disposal to help you with that. First and foremost, maintaining shield block is the most important thing you will need to do. This is the vast majority of your mitigation, and once you start getting into more difficult content, you will notice a massive difference in your general durability between when you have this and when you don't have this active. To assist with that, you have Shield Charge with the Champion's Bulwark talent. This gives you a free use of shield block every 45 seconds, as well as things like Heavy Reprisal to extend those currently active shield blocks, or Bolster to give you 15 seconds of it whenever you use Last Stand. Between these tools and Enduring Defenses for extended duration, you should be able to maintain pretty close to 100% uptime on this buff whenever you need it. Outside of shield block, you'll be spending a large portion of your rage on Ignore Pain. As mentioned previously, it is extremely important to try your best not to cap on rage, and with Ignore Pain being off the GCD, this is a very easy way to just dump some excess rage, gain a bit of defense in the process, while also still being able to use your offensive abilities like Shield Slam or Thunderclap. If you ever need to get rid of some rage but don't have the GCD to spend it on revenge or execute, this is what you'll use. Spell Block is a new tool you'll have access to in Dragonflight, allowing you to block spells for 20 seconds on a 1.5 minute cooldown. Note that Spell Block has kind of been changed in Dragonflight, so it does not help you against dots, only things like direct spell hits and magic-based auto attacks. So it's not something you'll take all the time, but this is a nice niche option to have. On top of this, Demoralizing Shout is a solid all-around damage reduction on a short cooldown. Notably, this does fully stack with other DRs because it applies the reduction to the enemy and not yourself. In Mythic Plus, you'll definitely be wanting to rip this as close to on cooldown as possible due to it being a substantial damage increase thanks to Booming Voice, of course, like I mentioned in the previous section, but this is usually fine as you gain a lot more uptime on this ability in general because of that CDR from Thunderlord. In raids, you may end up thinking more defensively in terms of how to use this ability, just to line it up with certain boss abilities and because you also don't have that additional Thunderlord CDR. But if there's nothing you need to worry about defensively, I would say use this as close to on cooldown as possible and just line it up with your burst damage to take advantage of the damage boost. Your major defensive is Shield Wall, a 40% DR for 8 seconds on a 3.5 minute cooldown, though this is never really this long of a cooldown because you always have Anger Management for CDR through Rage Spent, and sometimes you have Impenetrable Wall for more CDR through Shield Slam uses. Again, another versatile cooldown, though this one is purely defensive, so use it to mitigate high, predictable damage intake and try to avoid using this reactively after you've already taken the damage. On top of this huge number of cooldowns that I've just mentioned, Prep Warriors also have a decent amount of self-sustain going into Dragonflight. Of course, there's Ignore Pain, which I already mentioned. Shout out again to our 4-piece and Brutal Vitality, as this is essentially just Leech when these two combine together. Speaking of Leech, Prot Warriors have 10% of it passively in their talent tree, along with whatever you can get from your Enchants, which is quite a bit. If that's not enough, you also have a passive drip of healing from both Indomitable and Pain and Gain, as well as an on-use 30% max HP heal in Impending Victory for whenever you need a bit of a boost. The last thing to talk about is stances, which for the most part, you'll want to stay in defensive stance if you're doing hard content. In easier forms of content, battle stance gives you that crit and damage boost, which is nice, but it does result in you losing out on that flat 20% TR in exchange, so try and only do this to maximize your burst or when you're not actively tanking in order to give yourself an overall damage boost. This is probably an area that's going to show the discrepancy between good and bad Prot Warriors. The better you are at Prot Warrior, the more you know when you can swap into battle stance and the more damage you're able to pump out because of that. When it comes to preferred stats, it's pretty simple here for Prot Warriors. First, Eye Level is king, a common theme among a lot of the tank specs because it grants not only additional primary stats, but armor and stamina as well, which tend to have other interactions, which in Prot Warriors' case, talents like Armor to the Teeth, or things like increasing the Ignore Pain overall cap. If you're looking to compare items of similar eye level though, or in some cases jewelry as well, you can aim for Haste, then Versatility, then Crit, and then Mastery. Reminder though, if you want to know the exact offensive value of your stats and what gear to wear, you should always sim yourself. Next up, I want to talk about a few trinkets that are looking to be quite powerful from both Raid and Mythic Plus. Starting with Raid, the unique trinket Whispering Incarnate icon is basically just a verse stat stick. However, if a DPS player in your group also has this trinket, it gains a crit proc, and if a healer in your group also has it, it then gains a haste proc. So basically, when this is fully buffed up, it's probably the most stats you can get out of any trinket, making it a very solid option if you can get it used in this way. Decoration of Flame is another solid option, gives you a pretty large absorb on a 2-minute cooldown. This absorb refreshes itself after dealing some AoE damage as well and waiting a few seconds, so it's great if you need another defensive cooldown while also dealing okay damage. Rumbling Ruby is a raid trinket that I'm pretty excited about. It's a strength trinket that also gives you stacking attack power, followed by 3 frontal line shockwave attacks once you reach 10 stacks. This also deals more damage to higher health enemies. Having both strength and attack power on a single trinket is pretty powerful. In my opinion, the damage this puts out even in single target is also respectable from the proc, so this is likely to be very, very strong overall, especially in Mythic Plus when you can take advantage of that AoE. Pure single target damage, Spiteful Storm is likely going to be a very good option. Basically just a passive dot damage against your primary target that ramps up over the course of an encounter. Not much else to say about it, just passive, so good if you don't care about defensiveness and just want some more damage. Moving on to a couple Mythic Plus options. For pure defensiveness, there's a Granith's Enduring Scale. Solid passive option here. Does almost no damage though, so that's definitely a negative, especially for a tank like Prot Warrior, who's already so durable, so they don't mind doing more damage-focused trinkets. It also lacks control around when it actually procs, which is pretty important for a tank. In general, it's a fine option if you just want a solid set it and forget it defensive trinket. Blazebinder's Hoof is a pretty interesting damage option from dungeons as well, though the biggest problem with it is it lacks passive strength, instead having haste on the trinket. The 2-minute on use does have some strength though, and it also provides an AoE fire damage hit that can pump out some solid damage, so this is definitely a trinket to keep an eye on if you're looking for some big overall AoE damage. Then we have all of your other things, so things like enchants, your gems, pots, files, that kind of thing. There's a pretty long list of stuff here, so I'll just run through it all pretty quickly, starting with enchants. On your chest, you've got Waking Stats, Bracers, Leech, Cloak, similarly Leech, Writ and Regenerative both give the same amount of Leech. One of them just has an out of combat heal, so either here will work. For boots, there's Watcher's Loam for stamina, or Planesrunner's Breeze for some speed. Rings get that haste enchant. For your weapon, you can Sophic Devotion for some strength. Legs, there's a Fierce Armor Kit. This is a permanent enchantment. Now this will give you some stamina along with strength, as well as tiered medallion setting for your neck, which gives you up to 3 sockets on your neck piece, so very good there. In terms of gems, you'll want your Fierce Illimited Diamond, which is your one Primalist gem that gives you strength and haste. And for all your other gems, you'll want Energized, Emerald. These give haste and versatility. For your food, you've got the Aromatic Seafood Platter. This gives haste and verse, or your Banquet, of course, your Feast, which just gives strength. For files, this is going to vary depending on whether you want defense or damage and what type of content you're doing. For Mythic Plus, the damage option is Glacial Fury. This is also good on boss fights where adds spawn fairly frequently to make use of that proc, though this has no defensive component. If you're looking for defense, Eye in the Storm. Gives you a ton of primary if mobs are hitting you, so again, great defensively in Mythic Plus, or also in boss fights where you're able to maintain a decent number of these stacks from having consistently several mobs hitting you. If you want damage in all other cases, I would go with Elemental Chaos for some passive stats, and if you want defense in all other cases, I'd go with Tepid Versatility. In terms of pots, healing pots, damage pots, you've got the Elemental Potion of Ultimate Power, which is just a stat pot, as well as the Refreshing Healing Potion. There's also a toxic version of this, but I wouldn't worry about that too much. In terms of your weapon consumable, I would actually go with the new Howling Runes. These give you a bunch of haste. They're made by scribes instead of blacksmiths. Very, very nice for protection warriors. But there we have it, guys. Hopefully this video helped you learn something about Prot Warriors, and if you did, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like it. I have a ton of general and tank related content coming out over the next couple of months, including things like advanced Mythic Plus guides, high key dungeon walkthroughs from a tank's perspective, tank tips for all of the normal, heroic, and mythic raid bosses. Lots of great content, so make sure you click on that bell so you don't miss a single video. If you have any questions at all regarding Prot Warriors or anything else, feel free to drop those comments down below or come stop by my Twitch channel at Tactics and I'll do my best to answer. Also, while you're there, until December 12th, you can also drop 2 gifted subs on my Twitch channel to obtain the Ichabod Battle Pet. You get a pet while also supporting me, which is always appreciated. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.